Hello, friends. This week's guest is Cara Lisette. Cara is a mental health blogger and an eating disorder campaigner who has written extensively about her personal experience with anorexia. Anorexia has the highest mortality rate of any mental disorder, and unfortunately, rates of anorexia and eating disorders across the board have increased during this year or so of lockdown. It was really great to hear Cara's story and shed light on an area Seb and myself don't know too much about. Thanks so much for listening. Thanks to Cara.
Cara, welcome to the Earthy Delights podcast. What's the crack?
Not much really. Really looking forward to some of our restrictions being lifted in the next couple of weeks. I can start seeing my friends again.
For sure.
And going back into my office a little bit more. So yeah, I'm feeling like pretty good about that, I think.
How have you been with the whole the COVID situation? Has it taken its toll on you, or do you think you've kind of dealt with it fairly well?
I think lockdown 1 was really difficult, and then 2 was a bit better, and then 3 was really difficult because it just felt like it was just going on forever and ever and ever. But I don't cautiously optimistic, I suppose, about some of the changes that are coming in now.
Yeah, I think that's the best way, especially with our government. Cautious optimism is probably the best way, because I feel like full-on optimism is a bit foolhardy with the way they've been going about things. But I mean, hopefully Bozza's plan all comes together, and we can all go out into the beer gardens and everything else. It's been a long overdue. I feel like it's been 2 years, but it's only been a year, just over a year, if I'm not mistaken.
Feels long though, right?
Yeah, it feels a long time. But no, beautiful stuff. For people who aren't kind of aware of your blog and like your social media presence, could you just give us like a bit of a background about like what it is that you do and how like kind of we kind of found you and why we've got you on the podcast?
Yeah, so I started it about 4 years ago. And it was mainly because I'd started blogging like anonymously for a couple of charity platforms and like other people's blogs, because I didn't really want anyone to be able to trace anything back to me. And I was like, oh, I really don't want people in real life to find out I've got any problems with my mental health. And then I think it was when I joined Twitter and I found this big like community on there of people that were being really open about it and sort of sharing like their own experiences. And I thought it was really inspiring and like really brave of those people to feel like they were kind of able to do that. And then watching them just kind of gave me a bit of confidence to start kind of owning it myself, I guess. So then when I started it, I was just talking about things that had happened historically, and I was still like quite detached from it. And I would just say, like, oh, I had this experience so many years ago or whatever. And then kind of as time went on and I got more confident, and I guess the feedback I was getting was quite positive. So I didn't feel like I wasn't getting any sort of hate for it or anything, or any trolling, which sometimes can happen, can't it, in these sort of situations. And all the sort of response I was getting was quite positive. And then that gave me a bit more confidence to start talking about things kind of as they were happening. And then mostly I talk about my eating disorder, and that's because when I had a relapse in 2019, I kind of documented it like as it was happening. So it was sort of like a journal, I guess, over that time, rather than just talking about things in more of like a detached way. And then I've kind of just used it like that ever since, really.
Thanks, Cara. And for people who what I wanted to get out like straight away was people's understanding of anorexia or eating disorders. I think if they don't have a direct experience with it, is often fragmented or partial. And I guess I wanted to ask for people listening, could you really tell them what it is, like a definition, and maybe what are the misconceptions? Because often there's several misconceptions with eating disorders.
Yeah, there's a lot. So all eating disorders are, I guess, a kind of like part of the same problem, I suppose. Like a lot of them are sort of ways that people kind of cope with like emotional difficulties or trauma and things like that. But anorexia specifically is for people who have sort of like a really strong fear of weight gain, usually have some sort of body dysmorphia and see themselves as like bigger than they are, usually involves like an episode of weight loss. There is atypical anorexia, which is for people who don't fit the underweight BMI category but still have all the other symptoms. But for sort of like typical anorexia, they would be underweight and be sort of like restricting their food intake and then doing sort of various other compensatory behaviours. So it might be exercising a lot or purging or using laxatives and diet pills and things like that. They're really dangerous. Like, all eating disorders are really dangerous, but anorexia has the highest mortality rate of all mental illnesses, so it's really serious.
Wow, I didn't know that now. You mentioned body dysmorphia. How do you kind of combat body dysmorphia? So I understand it as you having a kind of inaccurate conception of how your body looks, whether you think it's either bigger or smaller. How do you combat that? Do you have certain people in your life that you trust that can help, or do you use some sort of measuring? Or I'm interested in that.
It's really difficult because, like, when you're generally, for people that are quite unwell with anorexia, there's a lot of what you call body checking, and that's things like weighing yourself a lot and measuring yourself and doing things like trying on different clothes, different jewelry, things like that, like touching different parts of your body to see if they're sort of the same size that you think they are, or if they're bigger than you think they are, and that happens a lot. And generally, the more unwell people get, the more you're doing it. So, like, I would be doing it sometimes pretty much constantly, always just doing things like touching like different parts of my body to see if they still felt the same that they did 5 minutes ago, or if my weight had changed in that time, and things like that. And sometimes I'd weigh myself upwards of like 100 times in a day. So it was really, really obsessional. And that makes it worse, because the more you focus on it, obviously the more obsessive you are, and then kind of the less grasp you've got on kind of what you look like. So when you're kind of recovering, they try and really sort of help you to manage not doing that as much. And then I did something called mirror exposure in therapy, which is where basically you have to look at yourself in a mirror in like tight clothes, and then just describe your body in neutral language, sort of like scan up your body and then back down again, which is honestly like the most horrible thing I think I've ever had to do, but has probably made like a really big difference. And my therapist did say to me, relapse rates are significantly reduced for people that can successfully do mirror exposure, but it was really, really uncomfortable. But I do think that's probably really helped, actually, because doing that just made me think, oh, actually my body's not really that different to anyone else's. And another thing about it was I started being really avoidant of what I looked like when I was gaining weight again. So I had these kind of two images in my head, and one was what I looked like when I was really underweight, and one was kind of what I thought I looked like in this like body dysmorphic lens of being sort of twice the size that I am. And doing that mirror exposure kind of helped me to marry those things together and see that actually neither of them were right anymore, and I kind of was just somewhere in the middle.
I was reading some of your blog post, Cara, and something that kind of, I guess, maybe I should have kind of foreseen, but I didn't. But it came across in your blogs is kind of the horrible nature of anorexia that is, especially for girls. As kind of when it starts and you're losing weight, it's almost like a positive thing. It's almost like, oh look, and actually you know how people would say to you in society, like, oh, you've lost a bit of weight, like in a good way, in a positive, almost reinforce. Obviously, they don't know what it is. They just think maybe you've kind of got on a diet or you've started exercising more, but they don't know that it's this compulsive behavior. So they're almost reinforcing that with these, compliments. And that's something really kind of insidious about anorexia that I'd never really kind of considered, because whenever I used to think of anorexia, you would think of the worst cases, the people who would just stick thing where it's so obvious that they were anorexic, rather than someone who maybe was normal or maybe even overweight and then gradually got to that stage, but in the meanwhile we're getting all these compliments about how their body was changing. I mean, how can you combat that, and how much of an effect does that have, that kind of positive feedback that you're getting even though you're in the midst of an illness?
It's really, really difficult, actually. And I think like for me, I've always been on like the smaller side anyway, so it doesn't take very much for me to become underweight. But even comments where people are concerned still kind of feed into your eating disorder, even if they're not complimentary. So even if people are saying, oh, you don't look very well because you've lost weight, or, asking you about relapse and things like that, like even that kind of feeds into your eating disorder, because you think, oh, well, I'm obviously, I look like I've lost weight and that's kind of what I'm out to achieve. But I think for people that do start at higher weights, that it just completely reinforces everything that your brain is kind of telling you. It's like, actually, people will like me more if I lose weight, and I'm more attractive and I'm more successful and people think better of me. And that just really I think like cements a lot of those anorexic thoughts that you kind of have in the early stages, especially.
Cara, can I ask about the onset of your anorexia, and to what extent do you think the environment played in it, whether that be a local friend group or a school group, or just the constant media projecting a certain image of how you're supposed to look?
So it started when I was like in my early teens, but I would say that I definitely had like body image issues from when I was probably around like 7 or 8. But I was in like a really sort of like diet centric household, and it was talked about a lot in my household between my parents and things like that. And like Weight Watchers was just like a really common theme from sort of as little as I can remember, really. So I think I kind of grew up thinking certain foods were not good and it was better to lose weight, and being thin was better than being bigger. Like really early on, that was kind of like cemented in my brain. And then I think when I got to secondary school, that's when you can really start like comparing yourself to other people a lot more. And that kind of made it worse. And then I just think as I've got older, like we didn't really have social media that much when I was like a young teenager, but as I've got older, it's obviously just become like more and more prevalent, and that's just made it probably harder to recover. Sort of every time I've had a relapse is like another layer of society that you've kind of got to fight against, in terms of like social media and diet culture and things like that. Kind of just seems to get worse and worse like every year.
And Cara, you spoke about how, it's this started maybe when you were 7 or 8 years old. I mean, the body image, body consciousness. I mean, that strikes me as being really young. But when did you know that this wasn't just, your typical girl trying to look good now that she's gone to secondary school, trying to look good for the boys or whatever, and this, that, and the other, to actually now, oh no, this is a serious problem and this is anorexia? Because I can imagine that a lot of girls maybe boys as well, but especially girls, I can imagine that them listening to this might feel like, oh, well, I was like that. And in my household, there was all, my mum was always dieting and doing this and that. And so when did you realize that you kind of gone over that threshold and this wasn't just a normal thing of trying to diet and trying to keep trim, as opposed to now, actually, this is a eating disorder?
I think it was probably like when other people noticed, and started commenting on it. And then I think I didn't realize it was as much of a problem as other people did. And then I started seeing mental health services when I was about 13. And that was when it was kind of flagged as, I guess, being like something that was diagnosable rather than just something that I was kind of just sort of pottering along doing by myself.
And did that come as a shock to you when you were diagnosed? Or was it kind of a thing of like, you knew that you were pulling the wall over people's eyes, and then once that wall was no longer there, then you're like, oh, I've kind of been busted? Like, did you always know in the back of your mind, or were you just like, oh, I just thought this was normal behavior?
Kind of both, actually, because I think I kind of knew that, like, actually this isn't what all my friends are doing, and I was doing things in secret, so I obviously knew that they weren't right, and I didn't want people to know about them. But I think the thing about eating disorders is that's so dangerous about them is you kind of never think that you're sick enough, no matter kind of at what point of illness you're at. So I think every time, even though I can see on paper, I'm like, I know I tick all these boxes, it's not until someone says it that you're like, oh, actually, maybe there is something wrong, and I am ill enough to justify this diagnosis, because you just don't really believe it in yourself a lot of the time.
And I wanted to ask you something. I mean, we're both from England, and I mean, we know that the diet and the way that we think about food just in general isn't the healthiest. You compare it to, Mediterranean countries, for example, and another Asian diets are a lot healthier in general. Do you think that kind of had some, like, that was at play, that force? Because it seems to me that, like, in England, a lot of us are very much of the idea of like, oh, well, I'll eat out, and we don't really cook in, so a lot of the food that we are eating is just terrible. So it feels like we're swinging from one to the other, like we're this massive pendulum, and we kind of purge ourselves on this terrible food, and then we realize that was really bad, and then we go to these extreme diets to try and compensate for our awful diets in general. And even like, even when I think back to school meals and stuff, I mean, I know Jamie Oliver tried to do his best, but like a lot of it was just like, chips and chicken nuggets and this, that, and the other. Whereas, I mean, I live in Madrid now, and I've got family in Italy. And when you go to schools there, it's proper cooked food at the dinners. And I think at the school dinners, and I think that makes a massive difference just because of the way that they think about food. Do you think that that had anything to play?
Probably, because I just think diet culture is like so pervasive in this country compared to like other. Obviously, I think it's a problem in like a lot of Western countries, but I think here it's terrible because we see everything in, like you said, like complete extremes where food is either like good or bad, and you either feel guilty or you feel like you've done the right thing. You know, like there's so much like moral value placed on it, and I think it's really hard to get that balance in the middle because I think even for people like my diet is like pretty good now because I've been following a meal plan for a really long time and I've had a lot of input from dietitians over the years, and I have like a pretty good idea of what I, not what I should and shouldn't be eating because I can eat whatever I like, but I guess what a balanced diet looks like. But I think even for people that do eat, really balanced diets, because we're taught that, eating chocolate is bad and you should feel guilty for it, even though that's a perfectly normal part of a normal diet, I think it still produces those feelings of like I'm doing the wrong thing by having this, and that shouldn't be normal, I don't think.
Yeah, and I wondered as well. I wanted to ask. This just kind of come off the top of my head, but when I look at like eating habits, if I kind of try to draw a comparison between men's eating habits and women's, being very general here, it's almost like celebrated in a weird kind of way when like a woman kind of picks at her food, and the word that springs to mind is like dainty and this, that, and the other, whereas on the other hand a man should be finishing his food, his meat and two veg, and be burly and this, that, and the other, and he's got a good appetite type deal. Do you know what I mean? But like I never hear that really said about a woman, oh, she's got a good appetite. It'd be put in a much different light. And I wondered, like, do you think maybe even just subconsciously that like when you're kind of picking at your food or eating less and this, that, and the other, and feeding into those female or male stereotypes, that actually, again, that's almost like this positive reinforcement of like, oh, look at Cara, she's dainty, isn't she? She's not like greedy and scoffing food down her face and this, that, and the other. And then before you know it, you find yourself, where you are.
Yeah, because you get so much positive feedback, if people are always just like, oh, I wish I was as good as you, and I wish I had your willpower and all that sort of stuff. And like, it's not willpower, it's a really serious illness. If anything, It takes more willpower to recover than it does kind of to be unwell, because you're kind of going against what you innately feel is kind of the right thing. But yeah, I completely agree. And I think there is a thing about just culturally women not really being allowed to enjoy nice food, but particularly if they're bigger. So like sometimes it's still celebrated if thin women are eating pizza and things like that. But for like women that are bigger, it's, really like, oh, you shouldn't be doing that because you're greedy and that's why you look like you do and things like that. And there is like complete double standards. I think one between men and women, but one between also thin women and bigger women.
For sure. It springs to mind because there's someone in my family I'm not going to name just because they might not want me to name them, but when they were younger, they ate I'm talking like 5 years old, and they'd be eating artichokes and all this type of jazz, which most young kids don't want to eat, and it was always like a real good thing. It was like, oh, look at this younger person like eating all of this food, and they've got a good appetite. It's always said they've got a good appetite. And then when that person went to school, like secondary school, that all of a sudden just it was like knocked on the head, and they started becoming really picky, and some foods they would have, and sometimes they'd miss meals, which would never ever happen in my household. I mean, coming from an Italian background, food is the foremost, it's like the front and center of our household. So to miss meals was just like a never ever happens. And like they haven't got, I wouldn't say they're anorexic or anything like it, but I noticed the shift in behaviors from a young age, then moving into secondary schools. And I wondered, like, that pressure, I imagine, like you said before, if you're all of a sudden now you're with like a load more girls, and now there's the whole thing of boyfriends and girlfriends, which at primary school doesn't really happen. And I remember at my school, like a load of girls, especially before summers and stuff, like during springtime, they would start to do like juice diets and all of these kind of, all of a sudden they'd be doing a 5-2 diet and this, that, and the other. And they were just healthy 14, 15-year-old girls. There was no need for them to be doing these diets. Is that where it started for you? Like, did you start these diets as well? Have you gone through the whole gamma of diets? Or was it literally just a thing of kind of being very picky with food and missing meals and so on?
I don't remember ever doing like a specific sort of named diet, but it was very much it was kind of gradual in that, oh, I'll just cut out this food group, and then I'll just cut out this food group, and then I'll just cut this food group gradually until all of a sudden the things that I kind of felt that I had like permission to eat were the sort of pool of that was very, very small. But I would say, yeah, it wasn't like a specific diet. It was just kind of like, oh, carbs are bad, dairy's bad, or whatever. And then gradually I'd kind of take away a food group at a time.
Cara, can you talk to me about recovery? You mentioned there was a relapse in 2019, but from your initial diagnosis, can you talk us through what were the cornerstones of your recovery and your positive state now, your healthy state now? I mean, are there like certain things that you just have to do every day, or there's a therapist, or there's a dietitian, or yeah, I'd love to know this.
So I had day patient treatment for like 6 months, which is basically like in between hospital and outpatient. So you kind of just go to the clinic every day and you have your meals and then you come home at the end of the day. So I did that, which was really helpful. And then just in terms of kind of getting a bit of normalcy back into kind of my routine and, you know, how much I should be eating really. And we did quite a lot of groups, like therapeutic groups. And it was just really good being around other people that kind of understood how much distress, I guess, we were kind of feeling every day and what was associated with that. And then once I'd kind of restored a bit of weight and was able to sort of cognitively start doing therapy, I started doing that in March in 2020 and all the way up until March 2021. And my therapist was like literally amazing. He was so, so good. And he made like a massive difference. And then I would say since then, it's just making sure, yeah, that I kind of do just like the normal things to look after myself, like trying to make sure I get enough sleep and making sure that I eat at sort of regular intervals over the day and that I'm eating enough at each of those times. I'm trying really hard to just kind of eat what I want to eat at the moment rather than thinking I can't eat that because it's 10 o'clock in the morning or I can't eat that because I've already had it today and things like that. Just trying to break like a lot of the sort of rules that I've got that are a bit of a hangover from when I was like more unwell, because some of them I could quite happily live the rest of my life having little rules like I can't eat breakfast before 8 o'clock, or I have to eat so many different food groups for dinner and things like that. But I just don't really want to have to live with any of those rules anymore because they've taken up so much of my life. So I'm kind of in the stage now where I'm trying to, now that I've got rid of all the ones that are really, really restrictive and kind of make me unwell, I'm trying to sort of break down a lot of those smaller ones now.
And you mentioned it was so beneficial to be around people who really understood what you were going through. Do you have a kind of a steady community of people in your life now that you don't have the day center care or the day-to-day going? Do you have a steady, consistent group of people that know what you're going through and you can reach out whenever you're feeling particularly low or you're a certain feeling? Can you reach out? Or
yeah, definitely. And I think a big part of that is because I've been a lot more honest about it this time. Because if you don't tell people, they don't really know how to help you. But yeah, I would say like this time around, one, I think because I did get so unwell this time, I couldn't really hide it from anyone anyway. So like everybody knew, but also I was just like, yeah, a lot more open about like, this is kind of what's going on for me at the moment. And people were like so supportive, even more than they have been previously, I think, because I kind of let people in and let them know how they could support me. So yeah, I've got like amazing friends and like my boyfriend's amazing and my family. And then I've also got like a group of friends who I've been in treatment with and they kind of know what it's like to have an eating disorder. But it's also really nice to have friends that don't, because sometimes I don't want to talk about that. And I don't want that to be sort of like the center of my friendships. And the only thing that I have in common with people, which sometimes is what happens when you meet people in treatment, when you both kind of move on with your lives and you start to get well again, you realise that that's kind of the only thing that is tying you together. So it's really nice having friends that also are completely separate from that.
For sure. I want to ask, we spoke at the very beginning about like how lockdown is hopefully starting to come to an end now in England and things are going to start to open up, and slowly but surely pubs and restaurants and social lives will come back. is that almost anxiety inducing to you in a way? Because I can imagine that one benefit, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I can imagine that one benefit of like the lockdown has been that because there's been no social plans, everyone has been able to kind of focus on themselves in whichever way that may be. And in your case, focusing on your diet and what you're eating, and not having these kind of societal pressures of, oh, I've got to go out and meet, Rebecca and Laura today, and it's like, oh, I'm going to go to the restaurant and what do I order and this, that, and the other. I can imagine that like social gatherings, and especially around like a pub or a meal time, could be quite kind of quite a scary thing, especially when you're on your road to recovery.
Yeah, it's really difficult. And I think one of the things that was quite challenging about lockdown is that I was starting to, prior to that, do things like go out for lunch and stuff that I just hadn't been able to do for years. And really kind of challenging myself. And then when that happened, it kind of gave me an excuse not to do that. And I would say because it's something now that I've done so infrequently over the last year, those sort of things are still hugely anxiety provoking. And I think maybe they would be much less so if I'd been able to expose myself to them more often. So yeah, that's probably one thing that does worry me probably the most about lockdown lifting. And also, I mean, there's not that many people that I haven't seen at all since it happened, but for people, like there might be some friends that I haven't seen for, a really long time that live a bit further away, for example, or like some family that I've not seen since before lockdown. I like physically look really different now to how I did before that happened, because I have gone through this like weight restoration process, and there is some anxiety that comes with like, oh, what are people going to say when they see me? And it's usually nice things like, oh, you look wow, and things like that, but that's literally like a slap in the face when you've got an eating disorder, and people don't realize that. So they think that they're saying things that are nice, and they're actually really difficult to manage.
I want just sorry, and if this is too much, then we can, feel free just to tell me and we'll cut this out of the conversation. But I wanted to ask, just for people who don't understand, I mean, me myself, I tried to empathize as much as I can, but the mentality behind like being kind of scared to go for a meal and like, to have that menu and to choose from it. Like, what is it that brings the fear, and what is it that brings that anxiety? Like, is it that you have to eat something and then you're going to automatically, like, can you just try to describe the mentality to me so that people who maybe aren't suffering and have maybe friends who are suffering or whatever, can kind of empathize more and really understand how it must feel for someone who's anorexic to be in these situations, and what kind of eating to them means? Because to the majority of us, it's just a daily thing. We don't think anything of it. It's just like breathing, like anything else. So to hear someone say that it's so anxiety inducing, it kind of feels very foreign. So I was wondering if you could just kind of really kind of break down that mentality and like give examples of what it is that would make you scared or anxious.
Yeah, a lot of it's like the unknown, I think, of just like, I don't really let other people cook for me still either at the moment. I'm still quite controlling in terms of like preparing my own food and cooking in my house and things like that.
Right.
So a lot of it is just, like a lack of control of just not knowing. Like, I don't know how many calories is in that. I don't know if they've used oil to cook with it. I don't know, how much cream is in it or whatever. Just, all these things that generally people with eating disorders are quite fearful of, these sort of like high calorie, high fat type foods. It's not the same for everybody, but obviously that's like quite a common feature for people. It's just the unknown of like, I don't know what's in that. So I don't know what impact it's going to have. And now that I've been sort of eating a lot more regularly and challenging myself to eat things that feel quite scary to me, and I see that nothing really disastrous has happened, I'm able to kind of challenge those thoughts a bit more. But when it's quite early on, you do genuinely think like, I'm literally going to just like double in size if I eat this, and that feels like literally the worst case scenario that could happen. And it takes a lot of kind of retraining your brain and just kind of testing that theory out really to prove to yourself that that's not going to happen.
And just quickly, I know Jim's got a question here, but just quickly, I wanted to ask as well, because Jim and I often speak. I mean, Jim spent a lot of time in Italy and he's traveled a lot as well. So he's seen different cultures, and something that we share a massive interest in is just experiencing different cultures and kind of comparing and contrasting. And one thing that I think Ireland suffers with this problem as well, but is the drinking culture. And a lot of us, we drink to excess. The idea of just going for one pint is a misnomer. It just that would never ever happen. And I think a lot of us actually, I mean, if you asked them, if you sat them down, they would say, yes, I know that drink has calories. But in the moment, a lot of us feel like we can easily, they don't feel so bad for having 10 pints as opposed to going to KFC, for example. Whereas I don't know the amount of calories that are in 10 pints, but it would be kind of equivalent to that KFC, if not more, I'd imagine. And so with the pubs opening back up and stuff, is that something else that you've got to kind of overcome, or is it simply a food thing?
It was more food for me, but it's a bit like eating disorders are really nonsensical. So I also didn't really like liquid calories in terms of like milk, for example, and things like that, and like smoothies and juice and things. But like alcohol just never really was like that much of a problem. And like towards the end of sort of 2019, and when I like just before I went back into treatment, I was drinking quite frequently because I just couldn't sleep and I was so anxious all the time. There was kind of like, not to the point where it was a problem, but just kind of the only way that I could help myself like settle, because my anxiety was so high. And my sleep was so restless that sometimes I'd be like, that's the only thing I can do to kind of help me like settle at night. So that was never really like too much of a problem for me. The only thing that worries me about doing it socially is I worry about sort of, obviously you have sort of less control, don't you, when you've been drinking a lot, and I worry that, you know, I might eat something without thinking and then have to have like the consequences of whatever happens as a result of that. And again, like I've kind of trained my brain enough now to know that the consequences aren't going to be that drastic, but that fear is still there, I guess, that I might do something that is going to sort of make me feel bad, I guess.
Cara, you mentioned before how I think you said you look well is a very dangerous thing to say to someone with an eating disorder. And I guess that one of the objectives of this podcast is to kind of branch awareness for people who might not know too much about it, who are trying to learn about it, who have someone in their family or in their friend group who they think has it or do have it. What would you say? Could you provide us with a gentler or more considerate approach to this? Like, you know, because a lot of people who say you look well, they have really good intentions. They think, oh, look, I think you look healthy. I think you, but as you said, it can be very anxiety provoking, as you said, for someone with anorexia or with an eating disorder. So can you tell us, or can you give us examples of when someone has said something and you really appreciated it? You know, you really like, oh, this is considerate of where I'm at.
Yeah, like I did kind of say to people, like when I went off sick in 2019, I did say to people, kind of jokingly, but not also a joke, just saying like, if anyone tells me I look well when I come back, I'm handing my notice in, because I'm just not gonna like tolerate that. And like it was a joke, but also it was me saying like, please don't do that because it's going to be horrible. Because it just like in your brain, even though I know it means well, it just automatically translates to like, you've gained weight, you look fat or whatever. And like, I know deep down that's not what people mean. But that's kind of how your eating disorder interprets it. But when I started seeing friends again, they just said things like, oh, you seem happier, and like, you know, oh, your hair looks really thick or whatever, because my hair was like growing again, and just like, you know, you seem like you're kind of becoming your old self again, and it's really nice to see how chatty you are, and just things like that were just kind of like nothing to do with kind of what I look like, I guess, and more to do with like how I am as a person.
I get you. More an indication of your expression, your energy, rather than how you physically look. One thing I picked up on as well before, we mentioned how you were writing articles and blogs anonymously, and then you kind of reached a point where you wanted to be more expressive about it, more honest about it. Am I right in saying that this was a key aspect of your recovery, the kind of honesty and meeting yourself where you're at? And can I ask what facilitated this in you? Because maybe somebody's listening and they're suffering almost alone because they were in a situation where you were at. Can I ask what brought you to that place?
I guess like I thought that I could probably make more of a difference to things if I was more honest about them and kind of put like a face to it, because I think that can make people like relate to things a bit easier sometimes. And I kind of thought if I like identify myself, I guess, then I can kind of make more of a difference. And the reason I started like writing in the first place is just because I wanted to help other people, and it just was kind of like a happy side effect that I ended up finding it like really beneficial for my own mental health as well. And like, I've always written journals and stuff like privately since I was little, but doing it publicly was actually really helpful because it's quite cathartic just writing things down anyway, but also getting that feedback of like, oh, actually this really resonated with me, and like I found this really helpful. And also just that like positive reinforcement, I guess, of like, you know, you're doing really well, and I know this is really hard for you. And people in my real life tell me that all the time, so I don't like need that validation from people that I don't know, but it's still nice to have that. So I would say, yeah, probably the fact that I started doing it for other people, and then actually I just found it really helpful sort of sharing stuff myself as well.
I wonder, did you find it really freeing in a way when you kind of came out with it and you just, you know, you put your face to the anonymous blogs and you said, this is me and this is what I deal with? Because, you know, when I came kind of expressed some of the problems and issues that I dealt with previously on this podcast through conversations, it felt really freeing to me because it just, the way I took it was, well, it's out there in the ether now, so I'm just going to assume that kind of everyone who knows me from now on has listened to that podcast, even if they haven't. I'm just going to assume that they have. So now I can just talk about my issues very openly in the knowledge that they probably have already heard me talk about it on the podcast, or in your case, written about it on your blog. So, you know, now, for example, Jim and I, we've met you and we already knew that meeting you. It wasn't like we met you and then you had to come out and gradually tell us that you're suffering with this problem. That's how we found you at the end of the day, was through your blog. And has that been really freeing for you?
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is because like I'm in control of what information is out there and what isn't. And a really big fear I had before is that people would somehow find things out about me and like I wouldn't know, or they'd hear it from other people, so I wouldn't know exactly what they did and didn't know, and whether they knew things that were correct or not, if that makes sense, because it becomes like gossip, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And that was like a really big fear of mine is, I don't know, what if someone I work with bumps into someone I went to school with and then they tell them, and you know, just like that's probably never going to happen. But I just always had this fear of like this information is going to be out there and I don't have any control over it. And now like everything that people know about me is things that I feel comfortable people knowing about me because it's what I choose to put out into the world. So I think, yeah, definitely, I would say, yeah, that's definitely true.
And how, you know, you were talking about like you were kind of worried about what people, if they found out through like gossip and stuff, what they would think of you. And I want to kind of get your, what do you think the negative connotations are of being anorexic, or of people finding out that you're anorexic? Because, you know, we know that stereotypically speaking, this is not to say that everyone thinks this way, but the stereotype is that, you know, if you're obese or you're overweight, the stereotype is that people will think you're lazy, you haven't got any ambition, blah, 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 blah. Which obviously we know is not the case. There's dealing with a lot more than that, but that can be the negative stereotypes attributed to someone who's overweight. So, but off the top of my head, I can't really think of anything that I would attribute to someone, stereotypically speaking, if I found out that they were anorexic. So what were those kind of reservations that you had?
I've had like a lot over the years, but you know, things like vain, attention seeking, selfish,
right?
Yeah, a lot of like spoil. I think it's seen as, you know, quite a sort of middle class white teenage girl's problem, and that is in part true because I guess like the majority of people that have an eating disorder, you know, it tends to start in white teenage girls. That's not true of everyone, but that is sort of like where that stereotype comes from. And like that was true for me as a sort of white middle class teenage girl. I was quite a stereotype as a teenager. But yeah, I think that's where it comes from. And you know, when I was at work once, like years ago, and someone said, "Oh, it's just you know, it's just a disease for like teenage girls that can't decide whether they want to be a doctor or a lawyer, or you know, people, you know, if their dads cut their credit card off and stuff like that." And there is this stereotype of, you know, it's just sort of makes you very like vain and self-centered, and that's not the case at all, because most people with eating disorders have got, you know, really like cripplingly low self-esteem. And like a lot of, for me, like feeling like I needed to lose weight was just feeling like I don't deserve to take any space up. So I need to be like the smallest version of myself possible. And a lot of that is about having, really low self-worth. And it's not about any sort of like vanity and sort of diet gone wrong and wanting to look like celebrities or anything at all. But yeah, I think there are really negative stereotypes associated with it. I think they're just probably less spoken about than there are for like obesity and things like that.
Cara, on your journey, can I ask, have you noticed, are there issues in terms of, let me rephrase this. Can I ask, have you noticed problematic approaches, how we approach anorexia and eating disorders? Have you seen, okay, this is just not working? I mean, I've had this experience, I've spoken with many people in a similar position. This approach isn't really working. Or have you had an idea where you're going, this really do you feel like we're making progress both like personally on a community level and like national healthcare wise? Do you think we're making progress, or where do we need to continue to improve?
Like one of the biggest areas is having people having to meet like a certain BMI criteria to get treatment, and that's a problem like nationally. And that's just because services have got so little funding, they can only afford to treat the people that are just sort of like the most physically and severely unwell, and that rules out almost everybody with an eating disorder. I think it's like 6 to 8% of people with an eating disorder are underweight, and the rest aren't. It's a really tiny percentage, and that basically those sort of 6 to 8% are the only people that are getting treatment because services have got so little resources that they can only really afford to treat those people. And also the problem services have sometimes, because their waiting lists are so long and they're under so much pressure, is they kind of help people to weight restore and then not really to do a lot of the psychological work that has to be done that's caused the problem in the first place. Like my service are amazing, and I've had treatment there 3 times now, and they've kind of kept me there for like as long as they think that I've needed. But I know that's not the case in a lot of places. There is like a lot of places that kind of feed people up and discharge them, and then they obviously end up coming back because they haven't done any of the psychological work that kind of causes the problem in the first place.
One of your blog posts highlighted the really high relapse rate with anorexia. Can I ask, do you think this is a chief reason as to why is that maybe we address the kind of physical symptoms, but we're not addressing the deeper psychological core reason?
Yeah, I think that's got a really significant, like that plays a really big part, I think. And also just like research into eating disorders is like not very well funded. So the treatments that we've got at the moment most of them are the same treatments that have existed for years and years and years and years. And there's just not really much research going into actually why are relapse rates so high and why do so few people make a full recovery? Like what could we be doing differently? And there's just not that much work being kind of done to find that out at the moment. So we're just relying on relatively out of date research to still kind of treat people. So I think, yeah, it's twofold. A big part is not keeping people for long enough to do that work. And the other part is that the work people are doing is sometimes really out of date.
Are you optimistic that for the next few years, did you see like at least seeds of possibilities of maybe increased funding or a change in collective perspective?
Societally maybe, but in terms of like more funding for services and research, no, I don't think so. Like there's nothing to indicate at the moment that that's sort of a priority for the government at all to be doing that. So in terms of like actually seeing any sort of change like on the front line, I would say there's probably going to be very little. But societally, I hope that we're still doing quite a lot to like raise awareness about eating disorders and maybe change people's perspectives a little bit.
Absolutely. Well, I hope this conversation can in some way help. What I was thinking is, well, for a listener or for someone who lives with someone or is very close with someone who is suffering with an eating disorder with anorexia, what would you say to them? Because we mentioned some difficulties. Maybe there might be a delay in public health services, whatever. What do you think these people can do that is kind of in their control? What would you say to them?
It's really difficult because people kind of need different things. Like some people, it can be really helpful if people are doing like their food shopping with them and helping them meal plan and supporting them through meals and things like that. But for me, that made me quite, I guess, like angry, people trying to get involved, because I just didn't want to make any, not that I didn't want to make any changes, but I just didn't feel able to at that time without the support of like specialists. So for some people, it might be really helpful having that level of involvement, and for others, it might make things worse, because that would make me kind of dig my heels in a little bit. So it's really variable, but I would say like the biggest thing is just like people being aware that you're there to kind of support them, because I think when people are really unwell, you lose like so much of who you are and your personality and like kind of like everything about yourself, really. And like, you know, I was not very nice to be around at all when I was really unwell, because I just wasn't like listening to what anyone was talking about, because I was just like calorie counting and thinking about when I could go for a walk next and stuff like that. Like I wasn't interested in what anyone else was saying, because it wasn't anything to do with what I was thinking about all the time, you know. But people made it really clear that they kind of knew that I was still in there somewhere, and that they were going to kind of wait patiently until that person kind of came back out again. And I would say that's something that made a really significant difference to me, is just knowing that no matter how long I've been doing this for and how many cycles kind of people have sat with me doing this, that they're still kind of not giving up, and they kind of trust that I'll kind of come out the other side of it and be the same person that I was before.
Yeah, that patience has to be key, because I can imagine like it must be so draining for both you and your loved ones to like, especially when you're relapsing, and just be like, oh, that had to have that high of like, oh yes, it's coming good, and then boom, straight back down again. It must be really draining. To have that patience surely has to be key. I wanted to. We spoke at the very beginning about how this is more a societal thing, in the sense of you're not born anorexic, but it comes through, you know, your environment, or any eating disorder. And I wonder if kind of the best thing we could do as a society or as individuals is to try to stop someone getting to that point through, you know, watching what we say to them and how we kind of react to them. Because it strikes me that, like, especially at school and secondary school and stuff, I mean, even parents maybe, but they can say things that to them it's just kind of like a one-off comment, or not really. They said it in the moment, like, oh, you're not, or you've put on a bit of weight, or what. I always remember, like, every time I'd go see my nan, I mean, I guess it's a thing of like, you know, older people just saying exactly what they think, and
Yeah.
losing that filter at the age of like 80 or whatever, thinking to hell with it. But she would literally, I mean, just flat out, I'd come and see her and she'd say, "Wow, you've put on a bit of weight." Like, as in, boom, straight away. Like, not hi, how you doing, how's school? Just flat out, boom, you've put on a bit of weight. And maybe to her it wasn't, or just a very matter of fact, like, kind of comment or whatever. But these little things, they stick in your mind. And I was wondering, like, if there's, what would you say to someone, whether it's a boyfriend, a friend, or whatever, who, like, little comments, like you said, they're kind of, oh, you look well, but maybe on the opposite side, little comments that we say to each other in passing that we don't think of as that damaging or anything like it, but actually can have a real lasting impact and kind of lead someone onto that path of an eating disorder.
I think a lot of it is not necessarily what you say to people, but what you say like about people. And I think we are like, certainly when I was a kid, and I still think it's the case a lot now, we don't really learn that like body diversity is acceptable. You're supposed to look a certain way, and that's that. And actually, like, people just don't look the same. Like, I could eat and exercise and, you know, do whatever exactly the same as another person, and I still won't look the same as them, because people just naturally have, you know, a different shapes and sizes, and that's just how it is. But for me, I know I didn't get, I mean, I got like the odd comment about my body when I was a kid, I guess the same as like all kids do. But for me, it was a lot of hearing about how people spoke about other people in terms of like, oh, look how big they are and they shouldn't be eating that. And, you know, God, I'd hate to look like that. And these sort of things that they still kind of teach you that actually it's not acceptable to eat the bad foods that are off limits, and if you eat the bad foods you'll become overweight, and then people won't like you and they'll talk about you. And that definitely, I think that filtered into me when I was quite young, of actually, you know, look at how people talk about people that are overweight. I'd hate it if someone talked about me like that. And then that's kind of, I would say, yeah, probably when I was like a young kid, I became really aware of those things.
Yeah. Do you think that's improving? Because if I remember correctly, like we kind of all grew up in the age of like where Keira Knightley and those types of people were like the girls that were smashed onto our screens as like this is the standard, and obviously they were very kind of skinny, kind of petite girls. And nowadays it's almost like a flip where you've got these girls, whether it's through plastic surgery or otherwise, but are very, very curvaceous, and that's now the standard. And again, I suppose it always comes back to pendulums. Like it feels like we go from one extreme to the other. But in a way, do you think it's improving that now we are somewhat, especially with women's bodies, kind of seeing a more diverse kind of portfolio of women's bodies that are deemed sexy or attractive or whatever? Because, you know, the Keira Knightleys of this world are still deemed as very attractive, but then you do have kind of the other extreme, which would be, I don't know, a Kim Kardashian or a Nicki Minaj type, which is that now you see a lot of girls trying to go towards that end of the scale. I don't know if you see it equally as harmful, or maybe eventually the pendulum will kind of center, and then we'll kind of eventually find out, you know, we'll just be more accepting of all types.
I think it's probably still just as harmful because their bodies are still really unattainable for a lot of people. That's still quite like a narrow margin of, you know, what you should look like, and actually like a lot of people are never going to look like that. So it's just a different type of body that a lot of people aren't ever going to be able to achieve. I think a lot of it, like in terms of social media, depends on what you kind of expose yourself to. So like I make sure, particularly on places like Instagram, that I've got like, I follow like really diverse people who they all look really different and they all talk about different things. And there's a lot about like body positivity and like, yeah, like diversity and what people look like. But I've had to intentionally go out of my way to do that. It's not something that's come up automatically for me. So I think you still have to, I don't think it kind of presents itself to you by itself. I think you have to kind of go looking for it still. And I hope that won't always be the case, and that we will just societally see that there's a lot, you know, a lot more diversity, and that's acceptable. But I think at the moment you still have to work quite hard to find it.
Do you think, does it make a big difference to you or to your girlfriends that you listen to, that when you have a famous person, be it an actress or just a media celebrity or a personality or whatever, who kind of is all out there for body positivity and is very honest? And, you know, because I've seen a lot of pictures nowadays of, you know, like where they've kind of posed. So they've posed in a certain position, which makes their body look amazing. And then they've just kind of gone back to like a normal kind of position, a normal pose, where you can see a few rolls or you can see a bit of cellulite or whatever. And they kind of put the two pictures together to say like, look, I look like this, yes, but I also look like this. And on the exact same day, in the same underwear and the same everything, I'm the same person. It's just lighting or this, that, and the other. And does that help? And then on the flip side, if that does help, you know, recently there was, I'm not sure if you saw it, but the Khloe Kardashian kind of controversy where someone posted a picture, like a real life picture of her that she didn't really want out there. And she looked just like a normal human being. She didn't look bad at all. But she got that post, like she got them to take it down. And I wonder if like when someone, I mean, especially from the Kardashian family, who you could say are like, they are the standard, they've created this whole image of what a woman should look like these days, to then have someone who they've posted a normal picture, this Khloe Kardashian looked like a completely normal girl, nothing wrong, and then for her to have that removed, does that in a way kick into the thing of like, oh well, even that's not good enough? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think like the first question, like those Instagram posts are like a bit controversial because they do generally still show like, you know, small white women who still can make themselves look like a sort of socially acceptable body. However, I find them quite helpful because like that's kind of probably what I look like. Do you know what I mean? So like for me it is helpful to be like, oh, like they're maybe the same size as me, but they do still have cellulite, or like when they, you know, they do have rolls and they sit down or whatever. But I appreciate that's because I can identify with that image and a lot of people can't. But yeah, I personally find them quite helpful. But yeah, the Kardashian thing, like I feel a bit mixed about it because I do really feel for her because they're under so much scrutiny, that family. And yeah, it must be horrible to know that that's going to go out and people are going to be really mean about you, despite the fact that you're right, she looked absolutely fine. She just looked different to how she normally looked because she looked like a real human, and not, airbrushed, etc. But I do think, like, the family as a whole have, like, really played a sort of really significant role in kind of making people feel bad about themselves because they don't put themselves out there as to how they actually look like. So I have a bit mixed feelings about that, really, because I think maybe she's sort of like the product of her own doing a little bit.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? Because I can just imagine from a human level, you don't want that person to feel like they're going to be criticized for an image of them just as they are. But then, yeah, on the flip side, as you say, they are perpetuating a certain image that is unattainable for nearly everyone, even them apparently, and that's definitely, I think, something that we need to ponder. Um, Cara, for people who are really interested in this conversation and feel like you're really helping them, we're going to link everybody to your blog. But can you also tell us about, you have a book that is coming out soon? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I keep forgetting about this until people bring it up. It's really exciting. So I put together, like, it's kind of like a self-help book for people with eating disorders, just kind of based on things that I found really helpful since I've been in treatment, even like from when I was a kid, when I first started treatment. And it kind of came about because this time when I went into treatment again, I started using like bullet journals to kind of track like everything I was doing. And partially that was just because it's quite like therapeutic and it kind of kept me busy, but also it's because I felt like other times that I've been under the service, I've kind of got better and then got rid of all the work I'd done and been like, oh, I won't need that again. And then I obviously have needed it again. So it felt to me like a really good way to kind of pull together all like the learning I was doing. And I wrote like a summary of all my therapy sessions and all my worksheets were in there. And I kind of tracked how I was week on week. Did loads of sort of exercises in there, and I used to post them on Instagram, and people were like, oh, that's great, that looks really helpful. So I kind of put this little book together, and then I just mentioned it on Twitter and was like, oh, would anyone be interested in this if it was like something that I was to pursue? And then a publisher contacted me and said, yeah, that sounds really great, can you send it over to us? And then it just kind of went from there, really. So I submitted my edited manuscript like 3 weeks ago, and now I'm just kind of waiting to hear back from that.
Fantastic stuff. I'm very happy for you. And it's cool just to see, like, oh yeah, I just put it out there and then the publishers came back. That's amazing. The one thing that just came to mind, and the one thing that came to mind, and I wanted to ask was, you mentioned I'm writing this self-help book for people with an eating disorder, and I understand that there are different eating disorders. But I wonder how much you think they do interact and they are connected. So, like, how much can someone with one particular eating disorder really resonate with another one, even though they are different? Because, so for instance, do you anticipate that people who do not have anorexia would still be very interested in your book and can benefit from your book?
I've really tried to make it as generic as I can, because I think the people that are least likely to get input from professionals are the people that don't have anorexia. So I think they would probably benefit the most from it. And there is a huge overlap. And actually, it's not uncommon at all for people to kind of flip between diagnoses as well. Like, I haven't always had an anorexia diagnosis. I had a purging disorder diagnosis for a while, and then it flipped again. And that's really common for people to go sort of between them, depending on just kind of what's going on in their life and stuff. So I've tried to make it as like generic as I can, and there's really common themes that run between all eating disorders in terms of like sort of coping with emotions and body image, and sort of like social isolation and anxiety and things like that kind of span across the spectrum of eating disorders. So I've tried to not make it too like anorexia specific.
Beautiful. Well, and when do you think it will be out? Do you have an idea of when it will be released?
It's between 9 months and 2 years. It's a really long process. Yeah.
Oh my god.
Yeah, and part of it's illustrated, so they need to find like an illustrator and do all of that as well. I'm not illustrating it myself, so I don't know how long the process of that kind of takes. So yeah, I just kind of playing it by ear, really, seeing how it goes.
Class. Well,
Well, whenever it is,
we'll be
we'll
champions.
put it on Twitter.
Yeah, I will.
Even if it is 2 years down the line. But one thing that's been really refreshing about this interview is actually the positive relationship you've had with Twitter. Feels like every time I hear about Twitter, it's just constantly getting bashed. So the fact that you said, like, to start with, you just came on Twitter and found like a community, and then now it's even led to like a book deal for you is kind of, it's nice to hear feel good stories about social media, you know, and not always hear the negative stories that we get on the daily. Where do you think, just the last question, just because I'm, you know, with the book kind of, well, 9 months or 2 years down the line, but coming out, where do you see yourself? Like, what kind of, do you see yourself carrying on with your blog? Do you see yourself trying to become like almost like a spokeswoman for anorexia or eating disorders in general, trying to bring awareness? Because I think it's something, I mean, I think your blog is something really valuable that people, they haven't already read. It's something really valuable because, like you said, it's not really in the consciousness. We talk about a lot of mental health that's coming massively, but eating disorders is kind of just dismissed, and it's like a thing of, oh, just like you can kind of deal with it yourself. It's not really that important, and this, that, and the other. And I feel like people like you are really important. So I wonder where you kind of see yourself. Where do you see your, not career, but I don't know how to kind of explain it, but do you see like this is something that you're going to take on, and it's going to be like a lifelong journey for you?
I hope so, yeah, because like I know that, you know, I get so many things from people saying that it's really helpful for them, and also in terms of just on like a wider scale now, because my like social media profile, I guess, is a lot bigger now than it was when I joined. I think I have the capacity to like make more change than I used to be able to.
Yeah.
And I can do things, you know, I've done quite a lot of like public speaking and stuff like that, and I think that I really enjoy that, and you can kind of influence quite a lot of people at once when you're doing things like that. So like I really enjoy doing that when the opportunities kind of present themselves. In terms of my blog, like I really enjoy doing it, and it's hard. It's really hard to maintain a blog. I don't think people realize how much like time and effort goes into it. And I think as I'm like recovering, it's probably gonna be updated less frequently, I guess, because I don't have so much to track on a day-to-day basis now because things are a lot more stable. But I'm definitely going to keep it up and keep updating it as and when things come up. But it used to be sort of like once a week, and now it's probably like once a month. But I don't think I would take it down, because even for myself, it's just a really nice representation for me to look back on, kind of like how far I've come in the last couple of years. But I do quite a lot on Instagram now as well, like more than I used to, of like micro blogging, I guess, where you know, I'm just writing like little captions about things and like infographics and stuff like that about eating disorders. So I do quite a lot more over there now than I used to.
Beautiful. I mean, just keep going, because that, it's just, I think as well, like you were saying before, how people with anorexia and eating disorders, they might suffer with, you know, massive levels of insecurity. And you said something that really struck me, which was, I wanted to eat less just to take up less space in the room. I mean, if that, it doesn't speak to kind of just chronic insecurity, then I don't know what is. So to see this same person who wanted to eat less because she wanted to take up less space in a room, to now doing public speaking, like regardless of what you're saying in those public speeches, like just the fact that you're doing a public speech, which is hard for anyone to do, it's not easy, that's inspiring in itself. Do you know what I mean? And I think people who are maybe suffering and are kind of at that point where you said, where they are eating less to take up less space in the room, to see that you can be a person who maybe has the confidence to do a public speech, or just to be very honest on Twitter and Instagram about their journey and not kind of hide it. Just that alone is inspirational and provides like a kind of a source of light for people. I can't imagine how much help that must be for people. So yeah, from us, just keep going and keep pounding that path, because we're following you all the way, and it's been really, really great to talk to you. Okay, beautiful stuff. Well, Cara, I tell you what, if you want to, I don't know if you, obviously we'll put all the links in the show description, but if you want to just tell people where they can find you, be that your Twitter, your Instagram, your blog, so anyone who's not really aware or familiar with your stuff, where they can kind of follow you and keep track of your journey.
Yeah, so my username on Twitter and Instagram is Cara Lisette, which is just my name. And then my blog is Cara's Corner, and I think it just comes up if you Google, comes at the top of the list.
There you go. Look at that. She's so
Top of
good
the
that it just
list.
comes up straight. Yeah. No search engine optimizations there, baby. Number one. There's no going to the second page of Google for this blog. We'll get there one day, Jim. Me and you will get there one day.
Yeah, we will. Fine. I just wanted to ask finally, Cara, like any last words, like anyone who's listening, who is there any like nuggets of information that you think that me or Seb never kind of triggered or like got out of you? Is there anything you'd like to say just for anyone listening at the end?
I guess I just really want to emphasize, I suppose, the importance of like not being secretive about it, because eating disorders like really, really thrive in secrecy, and I think that's why we've seen such a big increase during lockdown, because people are so isolated over the last year that like I know that my recovery would have been a lot more difficult if I wasn't so open with like my treatment team and with my friends and with my family and stuff. So I would say, yeah, just make sure that you're kind of not letting it win by keeping those secrets, because the more you talk about it, the more people can help.
Beautiful. Well, thanks so much, Cara. We really are inspired by your work, and it's been great to have you on. Thank you.
Hi guys, thank you for listening to the podcast. Please don't forget to subscribe and leave a 5-star review if you haven't already. Every review helps us climb the podcast charts so that even more of you can listen to our amazing guests. We really appreciate the support. Remember to tune in next week, but until then, keep safe and have a good one.